I say let's just jump right into it. Um,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
got
like
we got
sh-
another conversation
yeah.
about from the Consilience Project, and this time it's on the article which is called "Challenges to Making Sense of the 21st Century," and they introduce some really important concepts that I think are helpful or that hopefully we'll be able to show are helpful for trying to understand the times we're living in.
Yeah, um, definitely. And I think I maybe one thing I want to mention before we dive into the contents of the article. One thing that uh, Rowan and I are really excited about when it comes to, or we're interested in when it comes to Consilience Project is the focus on sense making and like providing us the readers with the conceptual framing to like to really ground our understanding of what's happening in the world um, in kind of more accurate, actionable ways. And so I like basically what we're going to be talking about is an article that's trying to make the case that um, understanding what's happening in the world is truly a very difficult thing to do. Um, and some of you might already know that, and then some might not. So yeah, that's kind of just like I guess contextualizing where we'll probably
Where we're coming from.
yeah, where we're coming from, where we're going is like yeah, it's like very challenging to make sense of what's going on, and I don't think we'll actually probably be able to communicate that completely through this
Or yeah,
conversation.
we probably can't emphasize it enough, right? Like
Hmm.
just how difficult it is, how the amount of uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly, and the amount of I guess models, like the complexity of models that have been constructed. Anyway, this might be getting a little bit abstract, but yeah, like the point is that I don't think we'll do the article justice just by talking about it. So like definitely try and read through it yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, okay, so to start off, like the article starts off and it tries to lay out and show to say what we were just kind of saying and to say like okay we are the basically like with the dawn of the 21st century we've really there's almost new realities or we're in a new kind of reality that is just so hard to understand the amount of information, and this is something we actually touched on last episode, was like just the amount of new information and then the complexity of it is making it so hard to understand the issues, and we actually need to um, garner or like we need to create like an increased capacity for learning and understanding the times that we're in. Um, kind of like I think they say like we need like a reinvention of the public sphere,
Hmm.
right? Like we, yeah,
Yeah, it relates to the first article that we talked about, where the main focus was democracy and the epistemic commons. Um, yeah, epistemic commons meaning like the publicly access, like the public domain where we can gain access to information and knowledge to educate ourselves um, about the state of the world and different domains of human inquiry, basically. Um, and yeah, I think one thing that they set out at the beginning of the article, from what I remember, is touching on the fact that we're at the dawn of the 21st century. The internet is in its full swing of uh, exponentiation, basically. Um, living in the world of information superhighway, is that the rate of information complexity is outpacing our human capacity for learning.
yeah,
So the models that we've used to learn and to educate ourselves, and like public education systems that have been set up, and techniques and tools, like basically our ability to learn and our tools that we use to learn have not um,
They haven't
have
kept
not
pace with the
they,
development of information and like our institutions
exactly.
that we have, which falls under the tools, right? Like they're not equipped to deal with the complexity of the problems that are facing humanity, and because of that, and they make that argument, that is why we need this increased capacity to understand the problems.
Yeah, totally. So this makes me think there's a couple directions we could go in. Um, we could we could talk about what that looks like. What do they mean? What is meant by we need, uh, like by addressing that the need for increase in our capacity for learning, and what does that look like culturally or society or individually? Or did we want to maybe talk more about the contents of the article before we get into that stuff?
Um, Maybe we can just touch on it briefly, and then we'll get into the further into the contents of the article. Did you have a thought there?
Yeah, it was just the thought about they're kind of making the case for a a new kind of culture around learning and understanding, and again it comes back to this fancy word epistemics. um, and in the article they like clearly define kind of three states of our relationship to understanding the world. So there's, epistemic hubris, which is like being super confident and sure in your understanding of the world, like you believe you have a completely accurate model of what's happening. And then on the other end of the spectrum is epistemic nihilism, where you're just like, you just give up. It's like, man, there's like too much information, it's too crazy out there, I'm never going to be able to understand what's happening,
Yeah.
and so you just give up.
They use the word post-truth culture.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I think that feeling probably resonates with people. Like you just like open up social media and you start scrolling through and you're just like blasted with like, oh, existential risk here, existential risk there, and it's like, okay, like,
Yeah, you're like, what am I supposed to do about this? And yeah, it kind of just causes you to check out because you're just overwhelmed, and you're like,
yeah,
I there's no way that I could do anything about this, so I'm not even going to try. And that's
hmm
if that happens en masse, that's a really bad situation, which is what is happening.
yeah. It's and so the sort of like happy middle ground is epistemic humility. So um, like you don't want to lean too far in the end of the spectrum of hubris and just being totally overconfident, like, oh, like I'm super smart and I know how to understand everything, and then just giving up. Like we need people to strike a balance in the middle and have some humility in their epistemics, and like commit themselves to
Learning and
continuous learning.
yeah,
Like exactly, like the if you're not epistemically humble, then you don't see any reason to like upgrade and learn more, and reevaluate your existing models of the world. And so yeah, I think they say it really nicely in the article. They basically say that there's like kind of two options for humanity in this situation, and those are, we either increase our capacity for learning at scale, to stay in pace with the rate of information complexity, um, or suffer the
consequences.
yeah, just suffer the consequences of a world where where complexity just continues to increase, and we have no capacity to just like handle that in any way. Um,
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's a really important what you just said is the epistemic nihilism versus epistemic hubris, and walking the middle line of humility, and they really, that's like a common theme throughout the whole article is that we really need to commit to this stance of epistemic humility. And just to throw out an analogy, if it's useful to anyone, I was kind of thinking it was like you're kind of on the top of a mountain range, a really tall mountain, and there's valleys on either side. Like one is on one side, the valley is the nihilism, on one side is the hubris, and you just need to walk on the line at the top, this line of humility. Which it's not easy, right? It's like this thin pathway, and you need to be committed to you need to be focused to stay on that pathway and be open to learning and yeah, and this is something else that like along that epistemic humility vein, like just having the attitude that no matter who you talk to, like they can teach you something, right? Like everyone has their own diverse perspective, and no matter how much you think you know, the chances are if you're talking to someone, they know something that you don't, and that's an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, just having that framing where it's like trying to see as many situations as opportunities to learn, and just recognize the fact that everyone has signal and noise, and it's like you want to try and find that balance or that space of interaction where you're like trying to filter out the signal that is coming out of the conversation. And
just to clarify what you mean there by signal and noise, like signal would be like valuable information that has some truth to it, and the noise would be kind of the disinformation, the misinformation that's filling up the space and making it harder to understand things.
Yeah, definitely. Those are signal and noise are definitely concepts that I'm familiar with, like coming from an engineering background. So yeah, maybe they're not as common outside of that space.
Yeah, or and especially applied to ideas. Right?
For sure. Yeah. So anyway, on that note, maybe near the end, I do have some interesting ideas for how, like, what does it look like to increase our capacity for learning at scale. I have some ideas for like what kind of tools could enable that.
For sure. That's definitely, we should definitely touch on that at the end when we kind of talk, when we can talk more about like, what could some solutions look like, or what are some avenues to increase that capacity of learning. But yeah, let's one of the main focuses of this article, and it's a really important concept that we want to introduce, is it's the concept of hyperobjects. And hyperobjects is they are one of the things that has almost kind of rendered the complexity that we see now. And that might not make sense, but hopefully it'll make sense in a second once we continue to talk about hyperobjects. So the term or the concept hyperobject was coined by a philosopher, Timothy Morton. And I'll just read a couple quotes here from the article because they were good quotes. So the term refers to those objects of advanced science that we live with as part of everyday life, and yet which are nearly incomprehensible. Hyperobjects are discovered and revealed by leading scientific methods, literally rendered visible through data. And yet what these approaches discover is, in part, the limits of our ability to fully explain certain very important phenomena. Hyperobjects are so incalculably complicated, or so inherently complex, emergent, and dynamic that their full behavior can't be explained exactly or exhaustively. This, of course, means a hyperobject's behavior cannot be predicted with specificity either. And then one more quote was that hyperobjects are so large, complex, nonlinear, multi-causal, long-lasting, and beyond human proportions that they disrupt effective public sense making and place great demands on individual psychology.
Yeah, those are really good quotes. It makes me, so just a thread to follow up on is the fact that it's disrupting public sense making, because like, and this is I don't want to get into this right now, but I'm just putting this out here so I don't forget. But like, yeah, our public sense making, i.e., our governance and how we make decisions and that entire process, it's built on very short time cycles, right? So it does not interface well with hyperobjects. Um, but what I wanted to mention first is what came to my mind when you were saying those quotes is cellular automata.
Yeah.
Because I think one common reaction people might have to like, oh, like what do you mean some things are just inherently so complex or incalculably complicated? Like, what if we just broke it down? Like, let's say, for example, someone asserts that the Earth's climate is a hyperobject. We just inherently, by nature, we'll only be able to understand, like, we won't be able to understand it completely. Or I mean, maybe even something like consciousness, but that's a rabbit hole. But yeah, someone might say like, oh, but if we just understood all the physics and we knew where every single particle was and we did all the calculations, why bring up cellular automata and I mean, we should pull it up, but we don't have to. People should look it up, because basically what it shows us is that we can understand the principles by which the like particles in a system operate, and there's certain rules of interaction, and even though we understand the rules of interaction and how the particles will behave over time, the overall system and the overall behavior of the entire system it's you can't predict it. Like you will. It's really cool. Like it's basically
it is really
like,
cool.
Yeah,
Definitely. Just like basically like that from a really simple set of rules, you can generate such complexity that you don't actually like, and you don't understand the complexity generated from really simple rules. And yeah, it's definitely worth looking into. I think Stephen Wolfram does some work with
yeah.
cellular automata. And
Well, there's a great podcast on the Lex Friedman podcast, the Lex Friedman show with Stephen Wolfram. And just to close out, basically, like the really interesting thing about cellular automata is that you can't know how the system will behave until you actually just until you put it through the paces, basically.
Right. It's not predictive, right?
Yeah, like, so you will only know what state the system will be in 10,000 steps if you actually run it through the simulation 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
And so I think
it's evidence of the fact of like something that seems simple, these simple rules can like it actually produces almost incomprehensible complexity, right?
Yeah.
Just like, it's like the environment, let's just reduce it down to all this physics and particles, but you can't actually do that because it's more complicated.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Would encourage people to look into it and just like sit with it and like really try to like, just like understand what it tells us about certain kinds of systems and like what it means to predict the state of a system, and versus just like to actually run it through the steps. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that's good. Do you maybe want to say some more examples of just what hyperobjects are, so we can kind of build up a conceptualization of them?
I would say that,
or maybe list some of the examples they said in the article. They provide some good examples. Whether that was like, or I have some notes here about it, right? But there's just some examples that we could take are like nuclear radiation, planet, which you already touched on, which is planetary scale climate change, pandemics, systemic injustice, world hunger, planetary scale computational architectures, the bioregional zones. Like you could think of the Amazon. So like the Amazon, like the climate is a hyperobject, right? But then within the climate and within the Earth, right, we have these different bioregional zones, like the Amazon, and the Amazon itself is so complicated that it's a hyperobject.
Yeah, didn't they? It's a while ago. It's been a while since I've read it, but okay, they ran through an example. If you don't remember, we can just skip it. But it was like they were talking about a plant because a plant is like, or biological organisms, like they're complex, but you can kind of like.
They said a plant isn't a hyperobject.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we don't, right, it's because you can just observe, like you can just look at a plant, see it and observe it, and like you don't need to understand how the cells interact and replicate and how proteins and different signaling mechanisms like make it all work. You can just like hold that thing in your head, like that the object of the plant,
and you can actually reduce it down and understand like, okay, this is the photosynthesis is happening, this is what's happening at the molecular level, like this is how the plant's growing, like you can reduce it, and there's not the inherent indeterminacy, and it doesn't take leading scientific methods to try and comprehend. So that's how like a single plant would be different than the Amazon that has all of these different species interacting and just so much complexity in one single region.
Yeah, that's interesting because like we haven't unified biology with physics yet. So like I think there is technically some inherent indeterminacy as of yet. But yeah, I think I get the point. And I think another point that they were making is that like a key thing about hyperobjects is we can only really see them or bring them to our awareness through data and models and statistics. Whereas a plant, like you can just like see the plant,
right?
And you can just like observe it and understand. You can kind of just like have this intuitive understanding of how it's working. But yeah, when it comes to something like the Amazon rainforest, you can't really just like look at the Amazon rainforest and understand how it interacts with the rest of the biosphere and like carbon cycles and like, there's so much I don't even understand, so I can't even like
fully frame it. But no, that's one of the things that they emphasize, right? Is that it really does take this lots of data and these leading edge scientific methods and techniques to even realize that these hyperobjects are there and then try and understand them. I just wanted to touch on like, so there's, and we've kind of touched on this, right? It's like the climate and the Earth is a hyperobject in a sense, and then there's a hyperobject which is the Amazon, which is embedded in the Earth. So it's that you can have hyperobjects embedded within hyperobjects. So your phone, you don't actually understand your phone. Like you see a screen, right? But you can't look at it and understand it necessarily, right? Like it takes, right. So your phone is a hyperobject, but then your phone is embedded within and connected to the internet, which also is a hyperobject. Or they give an example, just for one more quick one, of the ocean, which is a hyperobject, but then there was the oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico. Was it? Yeah, Gulf of Mexico.
There's been a lot of
oil Florida. Spills. I don't know. They had a, yeah. Of course, there's been I think it was off the Gulf of Mexico. Anyways,
yeah.
But so it's like we can't even understand like we can make some guesses and produce models for like how is this oil spill going to impact years into the future and what does it mean, but it is a hyperobject embedded within another hyperobject. So that's just to give you a sense of the complexity. It's like hyperobjects are complex, but then you have them embedded within each other, so it's just complexity stacked on complexity.
Yeah. Just circling back to the internet example too. Like maybe one way to think of it is like our phone is maybe a little bit more like a plant, but then once it's connected to the internet, now it's more like an organism inside the Amazon, where it's like now it frames this item in an external hyperobject, and um, yeah. So anyway, we don't have to.
Somewhat. I think they talk about how it's like you can't understand like the manufacturing of the phone, like all the metals and the mining process, and but yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Maybe
but yeah,
like a phone is probably more comprehensible than
yeah.
the
Like at
internet
least
right
you can
now.
hold the phone in your hand, but the internet, it's like uh, less of a concrete image or object that we can interact with.
Yeah, it's very
Um,
abstract.
yeah, yeah. The ocean, the yeah, that was. I enjoyed reading about that because like the ocean is not something that I think about super often, but it's like it is this huge hyper. Like I said, yeah, it's a hyper object. It's this huge body of water, um, and it's interesting. I think I remember in the article they were talking about how hyper objects are they're a novel phenomena of the 21st century. Like
Yes. Yeah.
before, in previous uh, eras of human history, we didn't need to understand, or we didn't have any um, pressure to like actually understand the dynamics of the ocean super well, like maybe just for navigational purposes. um, but now we're at a point where it's like, wait a sec, is this oil spill going to affect um, like
Fish yield and
exactly,
fishermen like their
yeah.
people's livelihoods and there's
Yeah,
all these second and third order effects that
that could affect, like I think what makes it new and also like very like important is that um, the scale of society, the scale of civilization now is such that um, we need to be thinking about these second and third order effects of our impacts, because they could potentially uh, lead to some really dark scenarios in the future where there's a lot of suffering. Like uh, little did we know, but our use of this kind of fertilizer affected um, the soil health, and now we have a food shortage. And now there's like what happens if 2 billion people, like there's just not enough food for 2 billion, like
yeah, no,
that's not
exactly.
something that medieval Europe had to think about. I mean, obviously there's tons of
Famine, but
uh, yeah,
yeah,
but it's a different kind of
it's a different scale, different
situation. Yeah,
complexity, and yeah, or like the nuclear radiation example, like Fukushima leaking radiation. It's like we might not even know, like maybe there's long term effects that we don't even realize or that we don't see because of the nature of it, like the slow acting
mm,
process, or storing nuclear waste,
yeah,
right? Like this storing nuclear waste takes like incredible feats of engineering, and the half life is so long that the you need to be able to convey the information about the danger and like how to store it over just generations and like just thousands of years, right? Um,
yeah. Yeah, like that's like that in itself is really interesting to think about, is the fact that we've done things to the earth uh, that we need to be able to communicate what we've done, like way further into the future than our current uh, political structures like
are thinking of, like on time
like
scales that we're not even that our political systems
yeah,
and
like
our institutions, our governments are not acting on these time scales, right? Like you can kind
mhm,
of think of investing, like you could day trade, very short time scale. You could like do a 10-year type of plan, or you could have like your whole life, right? And it's like
mhm,
you have different time scales, different time horizons, and
yeah,
what we're doing in a lot of the activities right now have these really long time horizons, and they use the word or kind of concept deep time, right? Like
mm,
we're engaging in activities that have effects into deep time.
yeah. It's just making me think that this is a really important societal conversation that we need to be having. Is like, what is an appropriate time scale for to be concerned about? And I don't know the answer. Like, I don't think we need to be thinking like 10 billion years into the future. But I also think that having fixed, 4 or less year election
Mm-hmm.
cycles, which really narrows the scope of
Can be
we can
accomplished.
what can be accomplished. Yeah. Um, like I think that needs to definitely be rethought and reconsidered. Um, yeah, because we just can't really afford, or at least this article is making the case, and I totally am on board. We can't afford to just like not consider the second and third and higher order effects of our actions in the world. And a fun example that came to my mind earlier was when I was living out east. I had a friend that was a lobster fisher in Nova Scotia, and he was telling me that they were like some of the fishers were just starting to like actually do research on or maybe it was some kind of marine life, so like fish or lobsters, I can't remember, but they were just starting to do research on those that species habitat and their like because and I just thought that was really interesting because wait, don't you like want to know how you're affecting um
Or
the
what do you already
population?
want to know type of thing, but
Yeah,
it's like they're just starting, right? Is that
exactly.
what you're saying? Yeah.
And it's just like I just think that's such a clear example of like this is the world we live in now. It's like the say pre hyperobject risk society, which I guess we'll get into.
Yeah.
Um, it's like we could kind of just like fish as many fish from the ocean as we want, not worry about it. It's like abundant amounts of fish, and
Cut
it was
down as
like
many trees as we want.
just
Just
replenish
yeah.
itself as as like endlessly replenish itself, and now that's not really the case. uh,
Unfortunately, not. We
yeah,
live on a finite planet.
yeah, um, yeah. Okay, I don't know.
Well,
Do you think
since you
it's
just dropped it there, risk society, right? Yeah. Do you maybe want to say some stuff about that? The idea
yeah,
of what a risk society is, which just going from memory, just quickly, I think it was German sociologist Ulrich Beck
mm,
um, talks about this idea of a risk society.
yeah? What I remember from the article is that it's a way to describe um, what are kind of the main driving forces of our kind of collective action. And I think the case was made, or at least they were in the article, they were just saying that like you can think of our civilization as a risk society, and how I understand what that meant uh, broadly is that it what it means is that a lot of our efforts, economic, political, scientific, a lot of these collective efforts of ours are directed towards mitigating, addressing, adapting to the risks of hyperobjects, which resulted from, which many of them have resulted from, like I guess the Industrial Revolution and the sort of transition from agrarian societies to like industrial societies. So like just for example, like the whole climate change uh, the whole change conversation, like happening in all domains of humanity, like political, economic, scientific, is a perfect example of like a risk society. It's like, a lot of this has been caused because of the industrial expansion and our increasing use of greenhouse gas emitting energy sources, and now it's like so much of our effort is literally just directed towards like trying to understand, like, wait, what did we do?
Yeah.
And what do we do about it?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this idea of a risk society is gives more context to the situation that we're in, right? And that's what we're kind of talking about at the start, right? And just saying like the increased complexity with hyperobjects, and now with this risk society where we're trying to deal with all these effects that we've created from hyperobjects, it just is making it so hard to sense make or like come up with, I guess, like constructive paths forward.
Yeah, that's so I know another kind of like main focus of the article was how deeply specialized the sciences have become, like how deep and narrow certain fields of expertise have become, and so it, like, hyperobjects are interdisciplinary, span over many different, like trying to understand a pandemic is, it's not just, it doesn't just require an understanding of virology. It requires an understanding of like economics, globalization, psychology, and like
all these
so
different
many,
disciplines. Yes.
and
yet the specialty is all siloed, right?
yeah. So we don't really have transdisciplinary experts. So it's this funny situation where we have people that are really well versed in like incredibly knowledgeable experts on these very narrowly focused domains of science, and yet to properly address some of the challenges that we're facing, that's not sufficient.
Yes, which is speaking to what we said at the start, like, is that we need to create this increased capacity, and that looks like, I guess, like maybe new types of organizations, new types of institutions that can maybe bring together different people, or in some way create a synthesis between all of these specialties to understand the problems, because any one specialty isn't going to understand the problem by themselves, or if they try, they're going to miss, there's going to be missing context, and it's like the solutions you'll come up with will just create more problems, more externalities. Yeah, I guess, like, so on that note, like, this is where the idea of epistemic humility, where we can drive that home again, is just like one of the best ways, like even if you're a specialist, right, you want to remain, you shouldn't feel like, oh, I'm so smart, right? Like, it's just the importance of epistemic humility to increasing this capacity.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say that's probably the key takeaway of this article, and one of the most important messages that the Consilience Project is sharing is, we really do need a new approach to a new kind of culture around education and learning, because ultimately that is where like our educational systems, that's how we prepare ourselves and new generations to be able to understand the world, to navigate the challenges, to organize themselves, solutions, and implement them, and invent technologies or create new laws or whatever it is. It kind of comes back to education, and just how we how we approach learning.
Yeah, definitely. One thing we could just this might be a little bit of a switch, but one thing that we could talk quickly about and was the idea of like meta hyperobjects, which I think they talk about the cell phone. Like you need your cell phone, or like you need you kind of like you need your phone to to try and understand the world, but at the same time it's a hyper object which is creating all of this uncertainty.
It has its own
or creating the complexity, right? So it's like we're dependent on something that in itself is contributing to the problem.
Well, that's a good point. So, just to reframe it a little bit, the article basically states that we are in an epistemic crisis. There's many crises that are going on. You could say that we're in sort of like an economic crisis right now with the coronavirus pandemic, and a kind of like a crisis of the biosphere and biodiversity. But another thing we need to add to that list is an epistemic crisis, and it's kind of like upstream from. And like what we mean by epistemic crisis is that we are facing unprecedented challenges to making sense of the world. So we basically just talked about that. Like there's increasing information complexity, but part of the epistemic crisis too is not only the fact that the complexity of information and knowledge is increasing, but as you pointed to, is like the tools we use to make sense of the world are also contributing to the epistemic crisis, because there are second, third, and higher order effects of the internet in combination with, like, bringing it back to the hyperobject notion of it being transdisciplinary. The internet isn't just computers, and like it's not just an engine. It's not just a system that's been engineered. It's an information medium that we use to communicate, and there's business models. So there's a whole economic aspect to how things work and how things design. And basically what I'm getting at is that current economic incentives have led to many of the ways we use the internet, and many of the ways we use the internet, i.e. the attention economy and micro-targeted behavioral advertising, it's like basically what it's doing at a large scale is reducing our ability to it's narrowing our attention spans, because like content's becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, and platforms are fighting for attention because that's how they make money from their ads. And so it's like leading like there are some pretty severe effects, like cognitive effects, mental health effects, and it's like, and all this is happening at the exact moment in human history where we need to actually be going in the exact opposite direction. Like we need, at a large scale, our like we need to be increasing our attention spans and increasing our cognitive abilities. And so that's like, it's just a recipe for disaster, and that's why they call it an epistemic crisis.
Yeah, it's a good argument that we are in a bit of a crisis. I think that's like you can really see that with COVID-19, right? And just the the amount of different narratives, the amount of misinformation or disinformation, and like the risks involved, like trying to understand exactly what are the risks, like how dangerous is COVID, like um, where can I get good data from, like or
Yeah, it's
it's like
basically
it's such a perfect or it's such a um, present good
yeah
example to
of
show.
hyperobjects.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like
which
it's
I think everyone could relate to right now, right?
yeah, it's really hard to try and make sense of the pandemic and the risks and like what are the future trajectories and stuff. Um, and especially if you try and do that stuff yourself, right? Like it's just like I don't have the time. Like it would if I wanted to try and come to these conclusions myself, I would basically have to sit down and like research every single day. And even then, I don't think that's possible. Like that's just the kind of world we live in is no one person has the cognitive capabilities, no matter how smart to like understand an entire hyperobject and
Well, and then you can't even like say, yeah, no one individual has that capacity, and then inherent in the fact that it's a hyperobject, you can't fully understand it, right? It's going to have this indeterminacy and uncertainty, right? Like, I guess that's the same thing, but right, like it's you're not even going to be, even if you spend every day 12 hours a day researching, you're not going to be able to say this is the way it is. Um, and yeah, being cognitive of that reality is just so important for trying to navigate the time,
yeah.
the epistemic crisis that we are in.
Yes. So I don't know. Maybe we want to start winding down.
For sure. Yeah, I think that was most of the main points of the article. Just kind of making a case for the increased complexity of especially like the 21st century and these new types of realities um, that could be thought of as hyperobjects or are rendered as hyperobjects, and that we can only see because of the new technology and the advancements that humanity has had, and understanding the risk society and the higher order effects of human activity, um, and then and then thinking about all of that within the context of epistemic nihilism, hubris, and
Mhm.
walking the middle line of humility.
Yeah, I'm just seeing here in my notes. They did kind of talk in some length about just like the role of the media as being kind of like a translation layer between these leading scientific models and data and um, the sort of discourse and research that's taking place um, at the cutting edge of different fields of science, and then media kind of being this its role to translate as best as it can to the general public. And uh, basically, what it does is it reduces complexity, like that it needs to, like
Yeah,
just
yeah, and this is really like I think they also mentioned this, right? It's like the media is our institutions, um, and we need to upgrade our institutions. It's like I think maybe, or at least personally, like there's a, especially over the last year, like a growing maybe distrust or faith in institutions. But you can't. I don't believe that we can do away with them. We need to try and fix them if they are broken,
yeah.
or upgrade them, or yeah, make them better to face the challenges that we are facing.
yeah, one, like I don't know if it's a quote, but basically in my notes, it says that uh, states and corporations are simply not capable of fully explaining, predicting, or controlling the consequences of past and ongoing activities. Um, and so this is kind of like another way to think about epistemic humility, because there's like, you could think of it as this kind of like individual trait that you aspire to foster in yourself, but it's also kind of like a filter that you can like apply to sources of information that you're coming across. Um, because if any one person or institution is claiming absolute certainty and absolute predictive ability, well, that's just not true. Like that's just not that doesn't reflect the reality of the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's like maybe another kind of takeaway of the.
Yeah, and it's a good thing to have in your mind for when you're looking at things, right? Like if you see someone who's or an institution or a person, right, who's making these claims of certainty, like that should be an instant kind of red flag of like how exactly did you reach this level of certainty, right?
Mhm. Oh, yeah, that's actually okay. This is making me think.
You just cut
Framing.
out there for a second. Sorry, it's making you
Oh,
think of.
am I good now?
Yeah.
Okay, it's just making me think of. There's kind of like another way to think about epistemic humility as well, where it's being understanding of change. Because, like, just for example, during the pandemic, public health officials may have said one thing and they go back and change. They're like, oh, like the current science now says something else. I know there was like this whole. I didn't look super deeply into it, so I could be wrong. Um, was it the WHO saying that masks aren't effective, and then they changed their mind? And so the framing of epistemic humility, like if that's something you care about and you committed yourself to, then when things like that happen, it's like, okay, like that's okay. Like this is just what happens. Like we.
For sure, I agree with you, but I also think that the institutions that are doing these kind of flip flops or changing the way in which they're communicating makes it harder to have that humility because they're not communicating. They're not like. I think it's specifically with the masks in the U.S. The government or Fauci was like, oh, don't use masks, right? Or masks don't work. The WHO said they don't work, but it's like really the reasoning behind that was they didn't want shortages of masks, right? So like, so you're right. Like you need to be flexible and open to change. The institutions, I believe, make it harder to do that because of like how they're not really communicating, I guess, with the public like we're adults in a way.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, maybe that wasn't the best example. And I think this is like going a bit off topic.
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. Like it goes back to what I was saying about like states and corporations are not capable of fully explaining things. And the role of media institutions and government officials as translating the complexity of, leading scientific understanding is like that they can't get rid of all uncertainty and complex like and when they do, we like what you were talking about is we get ineffective or communication in a way that it's like hard to tell what the ulterior motives are, and then for people that might not be as connected to science or scientifically minded, it could just lead to like complete distrust. And it's like, well, they said this and now they changed their mind. And it's like I can't trust anything they say anymore. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that was like basically.
I think that's most the main important. We missed something, but I'd say like go and read the article. It's well worth it. to see how they explain all this, and yeah, just the um really trying to think, I guess, like really trying to build the concept of a hyperobject um into your mind, because it allows you to it just adds like a support to your
Hmm.
basis for understanding the world.
Yeah, and I think like one of the biggest takeaways for me from this article, or at least it like just like reiterated the importance of it, is being okay with like holding ideas or models or situations in your head and not having an answer, like just holding uncertain, because it can be really uncomfortable where like we're basically innately oriented, um, reducing the complexity, and it's like having a solid answer for psychological purposes or for who knows, but it's very easy to like default and have our cognitive biases kind of like present us an answer to something, and so just like trying to um, just recognize that, and like try and fight against those built-in cognitive biases that we all have,
For sure.
and just like holding something that like, oh, like I don't, like I really actually have no idea why that happened or what this means, and I'm okay with having absolutely no idea. Like
Definitely.
that's
And yeah, being okay with that, and then as they say, like recognizing that you don't know, and then committing towards a new
Mhm.
ethos of learning.
Yeah, not being nihilistic. Like, okay, I don't understand it right now, but it doesn't mean that I can't develop my understanding and like
Yeah.
work towards.
Or even that, like on a larger scale, rather than just the individual, like, oh, there's these problems, and it's like, how are we ever going to understand this, right? Like
Mhm.
it's committing towards that ethos of learning, and saying like together we can create a newfound capacity.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exciting stuff. Yeah,
definitely.
it'll be
uh,
interesting to see what kind of epistemic institutions emerge from the Consilience project in like tangential initiatives.
yeah, for sure. They have a bunch of new articles out. It's hard to keep up a little
Yeah,
bit.
they're hard to read as well.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's not bedtime reading necessarily.
No, no, it burns a lot of brain calories.
For sure, for sure. But well worth it. And
Totally.
I'm super happy that we get to talk about it, and just hopefully spread more awareness of the
Yeah.
Consilience Project, and these
Yep.
ideas and these concepts. And yeah, hopefully we'll have more talks to come.
Yeah, for sure. I look forward to the future ones.